by sharing with you 6 lines of humanity's greatest mystical poet. And in these 6 lines, I believe, is the secret of your and my nature and the secret of the destiny of our path. Well, I was born in India, and being born in India is being born into a sacred world, a world that is revered and known and celebrated as sacred. I was born to Protestant parents, but I had a Muslim driver, a Hindu cook, and a very wild and eccentric Catholic nanny. So from the beginning of my life, I understood that God was one light energy, and that there were many paths to God. When you awaken, when your senses are purified enough, you will be graced the experience that forever ends one journey in this life and begins another. The Sufis say there are 2 journeys. There is the journey to God, and then there is the journey in God. But the real great revelation came when my father, at the age of 5, when I was 5, took me to the Taj Mahal. And he led me through the doorway with his hands over my eyes, and then took his hands away when I was in front of the great avenue leading up to the Taj, and told me the story about the Taj. And very briefly, that is that Shah Jahan, the Mughal emperor, loved his wife so much, who died in childbirth, giving birth to his 13th child, that he ransacked the entire world for the jewels and for the materials to build this ultimate building in celebration of love. I think something happened which permanently altered my life that morning, because I saw how all the beauty of the world, all the glory of the world, could be offered up to divine love. And many years later, I discovered that the Taj had in fact been placed at the end of the garden, which is unique in Mughal tombs, and had been created white, because it was intended not merely to celebrate his love for Mumtaz Mahal, but also to represent on earth, in earthly materials, the divine throne of the beloved, the majestic throne of the Godhead, which in Ibn Arabi's vision of the divine is placed at the end of the Garden of Paradise. I think what happened in that moment is that I connected with the great elemental primordial power of love mysticism, which later flowered in my adoration of Rumi, and I've spent 35 years now studying Rumi and writing about Rumi, and what Rumi's work represents for me is a Taj Mahal in words, a Taj Mahal that he offered up to his great beloved Shams of Tabriz. So that experience has broken its fragrance through my whole life. And Rumi deepens what he's trying to communicate in the 3rd line, which is a revelation of the essential nature of the creation being born out of the diamond light of non-being. Well, Rumi, in one way of talking about it, was a 13th century Persian mystical poet. He was born in Afghanistan, and he lived the majority of his life in Konya. And when he died in 1273, he left behind 4,000 odes, 2,000 quatrains, a 6-book mystical epic called the Mathnavi, a book of table talk, and innumerable letters, as well as the legacy of a life lived out in full public view, in full, radiant, divine, human enlightenment. That's one way of talking about Rumi. Another way of seeing Rumi is to really see him as the voice of the divine beloved in time. I think he was a being selected by God to go through the tremendous and complete ordeals of the path to become one with the One, and to speak from that elevation, from that glory, from that passion, to the whole of humanity. He was, of course, a Muslim mystic, but his work transcends all religious boundaries. The voice of Jalaluddin Rumi, the voice of someone who in his own life experienced this birth of himself into the beloved through the grace of the beloved. Rumi represents the authentic Islam, the tradition of divine love and divine knowledge and divine surrender that springs directly from the heart of the Prophet, who was not just a king and a warrior, but also a supremely great prophet and one of the world's greatest mystics. So the conventional or the contemporary vision of Islam as a bunch of terrorists is an outrageous blasphemy against the holiness and beauty and purity and of a very, very great transmission from the heart of the beloved to the whole of humanity. It bears as much relevance to Islam, this vision of Islam as terrorism, as it would be to confuse Christianity with the ravings of the Christian fundamentalists. Christianity is contained in the example of Jesus and in the great mystical saints who have incorporated and incarnated that example, such as St. Francis and Teresa of Avila. And Islam is contained in the holiness of the Quran's transmission, in the great sacred sayings of the prophets, and then in the lives and examples and philosophies and poetry, especially the poetry, of the great divine mystical poets of Islam, Hafiz and Sadi and Attar and Sanai, and of course the greatest of them all, the Rose of Glory of Islam, Jalaluddin Rumi. And one of the reasons why I love to share both the glory of the Islamic mystical tradition and the rose of glory that was produced from it is because I want so deeply people to feel this essential holiness of Islam. And I also talk a great deal to Muslims about their own tradition, because one of the sadnesses is that this Sufi transmission, the transmission of the esoteric side of Islam, has also been forgotten by Islam itself, and in some ways, in some times, and in some circumstances actually suppressed. Am I going to go on living in the illusions and ignorance and delusion and greed and narcissism and selfishness and stupidity that keep going the death machine that is killing nature, polluting the seas, reducing billions to annihilating poverty? Or am I going to believe the testimony of the great prophets and the great mystics and the example of the great sacred activists like Gandhi and Martin Luther King and the Dalai Lama and Nelson Mandela? I say to people, if you really want to be a sacred activist, if you really want to turn up in this time as a midwife of the new, if you really want to fuse in the core of your heart the two noblest passions of the human soul, the passion of the mystic for God with the passion of the activist for justice, what you need to do is to build a spiritual practice and that can create a container strong enough for you really to be able to face what is really going on, which is that the world is going through a massive evolutionary event which has two facets: a great death, a death of all of our fantasies and agendas, which any human being with half a brain and half a heart can see is an environmental holocaust, a spread of nuclear weapons, a devastating takeover of the whole world by corporations bent on the bottom line, governments in the pay of the corporations, a whole entertainment media system devoted to distraction and to the pollution of the soul by all kinds of stupid and vulgar values of crudity, consumerism, pornography, violence. This is a great death, but it's also the condition, a crucible, for a great birth which is also taking place. There are millions of people waking up to the danger we are in and doing something about it. There is a vast, vast inspiration from the divine opening up wholly new forms of technology that if we have the political will we can put into action: solar energy, new forms of energy. And there has been in the last 30 years a massive mystical renaissance that has made available to humanity not only all of the treasures of the revelations of all of the mystical traditions, but also, more importantly, their actual practices that were kept hidden for thousands of years.